on our radar screen, that we understand that that's going on as just a descriptive reality. The last one, of course, is Roman assumptions about patriarchy. We probably can also include in here Roman assumptions about sexuality as well. Obviously, the Jewish text, the Torah, also is patriarchal to a certain extent, but there are so many stories that disrupt that patriarchy that you do at least have the possibility of a kind of more egalitarian view of men and women. In the Roman context, things are a little bit different, where the patriarchy tends to be stronger. It tends to be more solidified. But as I'll show, I hope later on, there are also significant exceptions to that. And we'll talk a little bit about that. All right, so it looks like I've got a couple of questions here in the chat. Let's see. Hold on for just a second. I don't know if I can make her.
I figured it out. You're good. I got the live stream going, so.
All right, okay, good. All right, thank you. Okay, so let me stop there for a second and see what kinds of comments or questions. I can't see everyone. And so if you have a comment or question, please unmute yourself. Sarah, do you see anybody?
I mean, I see people. I see no one with a hand. Oh, wait, Tom did a virtual hand raise.
Yeah.
Can you see that in your participant box? Go ahead, Tom.
Yes, I was wondering with the current taking down of statues and such, when did Christianity take hold of using statues and icons, since that was forbidden in Judaism under the second commandment even?
That's a great question. I mean, I can certainly talk about the later iconoclastic controversies that happened in the 7th and 8th centuries.
But as they became more Hellenized and which were, Roman and Greek totally were into statues and idols. And
yeah, my sense is probably we're talking about the 3rd century. It could be that there's evidence for it in the 2nd, but the reason I would put my finger on the 3rd century is that this is the time when we begin. Now there are mosaics that are being painted actually back in the 2nd century, now that I think about it. But I think it's as we move into the 3rd century when we start to get public church buildings, that is probably going to be the time when you start to see more statuary. But yeah, so there would have to actually be something going back into the 2nd century and maybe even into the 1st, at least in terms of the mosaics and the paintings that we have evidence for. So that's about the best I can do in terms of answering that question, though. Other questions or comments? Thanks, Tom. All right, well, it looks like we'll move forward together then, and I'll pause in just a little bit. So what I want to do is we're going to now kind of shift out of the context question and really start to talk about how are early Christians wrestling with those two big questions that we began with, right? The first one is the big God question, and the second is the big identity question. I'm going to start with the identity question, in part because in some ways there are more earlier historical developments that precede the other question, and so I want to jump in on this one first. And we can kind of describe it as this: how did the first Christians think about themselves? Like, how did they understand what it meant for them to follow Jesus? What were some of the categories that they utilize? And I would suggest to you that the most significant category is the category of being a witness. They understood themselves and wanted to be understood as faithful witnesses. Now, the Greek word here, and this is why martyrdom is going to be important, and we're going to talk about this in just a moment. But the word martyr or martyra in Greek is the word for witness. So to be a witness in word and deed, which could in fact end in your own death, you can see these things are a continuum and are connected. But martyrdoms, and particularly what I'm going to describe in just a little bit as the Martyrology, becomes so important for how Christians kind of define themselves, that it seems to me that this is a great way, or probably the best way, of answering the question of how did the first Christians think about themselves. They thought about themselves as seeking to be faithful witnesses to Jesus and his resurrection in the context of the promises that God had made to Israel and the world. So let's talk about martyrdom a little bit to kind of flesh some of this out, because this becomes one of the main means by which some of this is developed. So first of all, as I've already mentioned, martyria, that word means witness. And early Christian ideas around martyrdom, as we also talked about last week, are already influenced by the Jewish notions of being a martyr, that is, being willing to die for the truth of your faith. And we see this particularly recounted in the Maccabean literature, and the Maccabean revolt of 164 is sort of the source for this. So and as we get into some of the texts, the actual texts, the answer to the question, who is a Christian, is that we are witnesses, right? Now, one thing I want to note early on, and I think this is important to note because we live in a time when, at least right now, I kind of feel like, certainly in North America, where there's a kind of always the possibility of a creeping persecution complex. The Christians are always worried that they're being persecuted. And it's hard for me, it would be hard for me to draw genuine parallels between what was going on in the ancient world and what might be happening today. So we want to note that, like, a persecution complex is not quite the same thing as the way that early Christians thought about martyrdom. And one of the most significant things is that there are several places in text, and even the very earliest one where we really hear, outside of the New Testament, I should say, where we hear about martyrdom, makes it quite clear that Christians should not seek martyrdom out. They're not supposed to go out and provoke and seek out the possibility of being persecuted for what they believe or how they practice. And generally, that's what it was. It was around questions of practice. But if it comes upon them, they should welcome it as a potential gift, as almost like a grace that God has bestowed upon them. And I'll talk about why that's the case in just a moment, because to modern ears, that probably sounds a little bit crazy to think about the possibility that you would be able to be a martyr as a gift. The first of the texts that I have here, though, kind of a citation here, comes from Ignatius of Antioch. And he is important because he really is, outside of sort of the martyrdom of Stephen that we hear about in the book of Acts, this is really the first text that you would turn to hear someone reflecting on the fact that they are probably going to face their death. Ignatius is an overseer or a bishop, and I'll talk about some of that stuff later, of the city of Antioch. He winds up getting caught up in I think it's Domitian is the emperor, but it's a sporadic, but nevertheless effective and deadly persecution that happens in certain areas in the empire. And as you can see here, he says, and he's kind of writing to the Roman church, and he knows he's kind of heading in that direction, that he asked him not to be ye not, I'm sorry for the translation here, but be ye not an unseasonable kindness to me. Let me be given to the wild beasts, for through them I can attain unto God. I am God's wheat, and I am grounded by the teeth of wild beasts, that I may be found pure bread of Christ. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the imagery of that in just a moment. Before I do that, though, I want us to consider what is it exactly that leads the Romans to persecute in the first place. And let me kind of slightly amend that, first of all, with a reminder here at the very beginning that it's not so much from the Roman perspective, it's not persecution, it's prosecution, right? They view the Christians as illicit and illegal, and certainly a threat to public order and public piety is perhaps, in fact, there's a famous book, or not a famous one, but a recent book out that uses that as a great kind of slogan. So what are some of the reasons? And I'm going to kind of offer to you sort of 4 broad reasons that you can kind of gather a number of the sources that, from what we can tell, for what it is that the Romans felt threatened by. The first is just the broad question of treason. There's always this issue around why is it that Christians refuse to swear allegiance to either the Roman emperor or to Rome herself in the form of offering incense. Now, Christians, from what we can tell, at least in theory, all right, and I want to make that clear, because there are times when actual persecutions happen and many Christians will actually capitulate and they will offer incense. But in theory, offering incense to Rome or the Roman emperor was generally viewed as a form of idolatry. And so Christians generally sought to not do that. And so this became a kind of seed that this may be a treasonous presence in the empire. The second thing is, it kind of connects to the first, but the early Christians tended to stay away from what we might consider kind of patriotic type of events. And what I mean by that is your city might have a celebration where they distribute food, where you come together, perhaps there's singing, perhaps there's the telling of stories about your community or whatever. But those events always included the presence of pagan traditions and pagan deities, I guess you could say. And so Christians tended to stay away from this, and they were accused, first of all, of being atheists because they didn't believe in the gods, and they were considered to be misanthropes, that is, haters of humanity, because they would not participate in basically these very important cultural events that were meant to strengthen and renew the bonds of a community. And all of this then was seen as a threat to the public good, and not just because they're not willing to kind of show up with their neighbors and hang out and have some meat that might have been sacrificed to an idol. It's because the way oftentimes that the ancient world thought about the good health of their city was always interconnected with how they were offering the proper piety to the gods, right? So your city's health depended in some sense on how you fulfilled your calling as devotees of Athena or something of that nature. So they were seen as a significant threat in that regard in terms of the mythology of the cities and the empire. The third thing that we can note is that now it's kind of hard to not be a slave in the ancient world. I mean, I'd say over 50% of the population was enslaved in one form or another. I think I had numbers on this, but I don't have them with me today. So most of the Christian population comes predominantly from the slave class, and the habit of Christians, certainly in these early periods, meeting together in private also created a certain amount of anxiety for authorities. And I think this is understandable, because I think it's in the 1st or 2nd century alone, there's over 150 slave revolts. And so this is a society that is always in fear of the underclass getting out of control and demanding something more from their state of life than what they are experiencing. So Christians who include significant numbers of people who are enslaved in one form or another in their meetings are going to be viewed very suspiciously as places where a seedbed of revolt or rebellion could come out of. And then the last category is kind of a catch-all, and this has to do both with sort of the sporadic nature of early persecutions or early experiences of persecution for Christians, but it also can connect to larger kinds of things. So the political scapegoats here, I'm referring specifically to the earliest persecution that we hear about, the one that, according to tradition, claims the life of Peter and Paul. And this happens in 64 AD or CE. And this is Nero's persecution. So Nero decides he wants to redesign the city of Rome. And the only way he's going to be able to do it is to tear down the city. So he decides to set the city on fire, which leads to, I think it's like 3/4 of the city burning down. And the populace knows that he's responsible for it. And of course, he needs to find someone to blame. So he winds up actually blaming the Christian population, which is a very, very small population in the city at this point. And so some of our earliest sort of tradition-wise, at least accounts, come from this period. The plain envy piece has simply to do with the everyday experience, potentially, of if you were a Christian and you had like a tanning business, or you were a metal worker or something like that, and your neighbor saw that you were successful, they could potentially be driven to, attack you, to try to take away your business, or if they felt a certain kind of economic threat to their own. So plain envy here. So there, a lot of times we don't know exactly what the motives are, and sometimes it just kind of comes down to money or envy or other things like that. So now the last thing we want to note are the central persecutions. Christians are experiencing persecution, prosecution, sporadically from time to time. There are large ones, but they're really the biggest ones that happen within the confines of the Roman Empire, all take place in the 3rd century. The first one is the Decian persecution, and then the second one is the Great Persecution, which is overseen by Emperor Diocletian. Both of these persecutions were seen as or understood as attempts to revitalize Greco-Roman pagan culture, right? To refocus and bring back together a populace that felt like it was beginning to fray and come apart. And so they began to make a kind of order that people would come together and pledge allegiance to the Roman state and to the emperor by offering incense. And many, many Christians refuse to do this. Many, many other Christians actually agree to do it. And this actually will wind up creating a rift within the church in certain areas, particularly in North Africa. So these are the most important. So what are the kinds of experiences that they have? This could include the destruction or confiscation of church buildings. This could include the burning of books. And generally, when you hear about critiques of Christians who capitulate, particularly leaders, it's usually that they hand over sacred texts. And those sacred texts, of course, presumably are going to wind up being burned. And then, of course, there's the order, oftentimes, not always the case, that Christians would recant or experience torture or execution. And then the last component, one that I don't have included here, is simply taxation. Taxation was another way of excising something from someone that could be understood, certainly from a Christian perspective, as an experience of persecution. So most of this ends, at least in terms of the broad early Christian movement, around 311. This is when the Edict of Toleration is issued. But if we were going to take our story further on, we're going to find out that Christians eventually are going to start persecuting their own. So persecution doesn't actually go away within the church, unfortunately. The last thing that I have done here, before I turn back to how Christians understand themselves, is just to provide you this little quote from Tacitus. And what Tacitus here is reflecting on is the persecution of Nero. And again, this is in your outline. So it says, before killing the Christians, Nero used them to amuse the people. Some were dressed in furs to be killed by dogs. Others were crucified. So others were set on fire early in the night so that they might illuminate it. Nero opened his own gardens for these shows, and in the circus, he himself became a spectacle. He mingled with the people dressed as a charioteer, or he rode around in his chariot. All of this, and this is an interesting section, all this aroused the mercy of the people, even against these culprits who deserved an exemplary punishment. For it was clear that they were not being destroyed for the common good, but rather to satisfy the cruelty of one person. So this text is really interesting in part because you can tell Tacitus doesn't care for the Christians, but he also doesn't care for Nero. but it does give you an idea when a persecution happened, this is the kind of violence that could be unleashed on the community. So how do Christians deal with this? How do they kind of turn this into a moment for potential self-definition, if we're going to really say that martyr is essential to them? Well, first of all, and I'm going to give to you really two broad categories for how they thought about this. The first is that the experience of martyrdom and then the subsequent category of being a martyr was very much connected with the idea that to be a disciple is to follow after Jesus, to follow in Jesus's footsteps, and therefore in some way or another to try to imitate Christ, right? So a martyr is generally understood as a kind of non-identical repetition of Christ. And we see this in the texts that tell us the stories. I'm going to turn just a second to talk about those, because almost every single account of a martyrdom, at some point, the author who's recounting the tale will describe the individual who's being martyred as they will look like they're hanging on a cross. They will look like they are like the suffering Jesus. So it is always an imitation of Christ. And so we can kind of take this in a more global sense to say, if to be a witness is central to Christian identity, what that means is in word and deed to try to walk in the way of Jesus, even if that means having to be faithful unto death. And the vast majority, of course, of Christians are not martyred during this time. I was going to get into ascetic practice, but we're not going to be able to do this today, but I'll come back to it. But ascetic practice is connected to martyrdom because you practice ascetic practices so that you will have the inner resources to actually resist temptation when the difficulty comes of maybe being a martyr. And you could think about this both in terms of red martyrdom, that is the martyrdom with blood, or you could think of it as a different kind of martyrdom, like being willing to speak to your neighbor, being willing to give away your goods, being willing to care for whatever the case may be. Ascetic practice was meant to shape you into the person who would have the internal resources to do that kind of work. And I'm going to talk about asceticism next week. So Christ dies for the truth. Christians die for the truth of Christ, and thereby they seal their testimony in blood. That's the way that early Christians are talking about martyrdom as an actual phenomenon. So the first real martyrdom that we could say this is an account, specific account that becomes very, very influential is the martyrdom of Polycarp. Martyrdom, as I mentioned here, it's so central to the Christian imagination about how they think about themselves that it actually gives birth to a new type of literature in the 2nd century that is described as the Martyrology. So the Martyrology is a text that is specifically devoted to telling the story of how a person is pursued, captured, tortured, and eventually is killed. All right. What these documents can be understood as, I would describe as an attempt to offer a theological interpretation of events that are rooted to a certain extent in history. We want to make sure that we're careful here in how we think about what history means, but I would suggest that most of the martyrdom stories have some root in reality, even if the telling of the story is very definitely shaped by a theological view of what's going on. As I mentioned here, a key element in all of these stories, all the martyrdoms, and particularly in Polycarp, he sort of sets the tone, is when the martyr is configured as a form of Christ. And I'm going to give you a passage here in just a moment to consider. So my last point in regards to this is that really only a small number of people are actually martyred, but the event of those who are martyred, they become sort of examples of what it means to be faithful. And so one way of thinking about a martyrology is to think about it as a text that an early Christian would read to be challenged by and inspired by. And so it's a kind of discipleship manual. And it really is saying, it's not saying you should go out and seek martyrdom, because that's not what it says at all. It's saying, will you have the ability to be faithful when the time comes for you? Sometimes that might be in the arena when you're facing the wild animals, or sometimes it might be, you know, when you're interacting with your neighbor, or whatever the case may be. So that's the way that that kind of idea functions, I think. So Polycarp, as I mentioned, he is really our first figure that we hear about his actual martyrdom. He probably dies somewhere around 156, somewhere in the mid 150s. We know a few things about him. He's a bishop of, all these things that we know about him come from him, or Eusebius. So it's according to tradition here. He himself is a bishop or overseer of the city of Smyrna, which is in modern day Turkey, Antioch, or Anatolia. Thought to have been a disciple of John, and also a mentor of a later figure that we'll talk about later on, Irenaeus. We only have one writing from his hand. What happened? Looks like my sharing window got disrupted. I'll try to finish this out very quickly here.
I can see it.
You can still see it?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm
good.
seeing Steve Anderson's head nodding. So
Yes. Oh, good. Well, it shifted me around and made me go into some sort of Java update. So I apologize for that. I will get back to what I'm doing here. So we only have one writing that's actually from Polycarp's hand. And this is when he's writing a letter to the church at Philippi. And then what we have is the martyrdom itself, which is not written by Polycarp. It's written by someone else later on. And it offers a theological interpretation of what happens to Polycarp. So here is kind of a crescendo moment in the text with Polycarp. And it says here, and I'll just kind of read this for you, and then I want to unpack it just for a second, a couple of the images here. So this is the moment when he's about to die, right? So when he had finished his prayer, the fire was kindled. And as the flame blazed forth in great fury, we beheld a great miracle. For the fire, shaping itself into the form of an arch, like the sail of a ship when filled with the wind, encompassed as by a circle the body of the martyr. Now that image right there of fire encircling someone, that becomes a central image later on for Christian iconography. So we have this kind of fire encircling him, and he appeared within, not like the flesh which is burnt, but as bread that is baked, or as gold and silver glowing in a furnace. Moreover, we perceive such a sweet odor as if precious spices had been smoking there. So in this case, the imagery is Polycarp is transformed into the Eucharistic bread, right? The body of Christ. So it's not a direct, he looks like Jesus or he's on a cross. I've got another passage for you that does that. Here, though, it's a different metaphor for Jesus, which is the bread that is baked that becomes a component part of how Polycarp and his experience is understood. All right, very last thing then, the second major category. So if the first category is about imitation of Christ, and maybe we could say certainly directly connects to notions of Christian discipleship, the second one is what I would call a political theology, is also at play in these martyrologies. And basically what I mean is that these are documents that make it clear in no uncertain terms that Christian loyalty is not to the Roman state, it is rather to Jesus the crucified, right? So absolute loyalty to the Son of God, and not to Augustus or any of the other emperors who proclaim themselves to be sons of God. So these martyrologies always also include some sort of an illusion that the drama that's playing out in this individual's life is not just about the individual, and it's not even just about the individual and the Roman state, it's also about God confronting the powers of Rome, which at this point in time kind of stands for something like Babylon. So this is why I think it's important to see this as a kind of political theology as well, a statement of resistance. And one of the ways that, you could call this foolhardy if you want, but this is one of the implications, is that the suffering of the martyr does not mean, it doesn't actually allude to the martyr's end. It rather is a kind of birth pang of the end of the world. And what that means, of course, is going to be the end of Rome. So the suffering of the martyr, the suffering that they undergo, this is why they talk about it as a refining experience. That's an apocalyptic kind of set of imagery. So in addition to that, then we have this as an act of self-definition. Martyrs are always depicted as being in the setting that they're in by their own choice. They are not just victims. They are people who have chosen, in a sense, to accept what has come to them as a gift. And there are oftentimes in key martyrological texts places where the martyr will simply say, "I am a Christian." And so that is a kind of statement of self-definition that kind of we need to take out of these texts as well. And then lastly is, and I also include this under political theology, is that courage and eloquence are very much a component part of the way that these martyrologies are configured. Courage, of course, in the face of death, but eloquence here is very important because one of the ideas that the Romans held was that when you were faced with something as definitive as death, and a painful death at that, you might have the likelihood of losing your mind. And the fact that you could keep your wits about you and speak eloquently was thought to have been a sort of an expression of virtue. And so two of the key virtues then that the Romans themselves prized, they are always appropriated by these authors of these martyrologies and show how the martyrs themselves exemplify these things. And that's especially also the case with women. And we have some very early women's martyrologies. And so I want to share this very last quote here with you, and then I'll take some questions and then we'll kind of shut things down. So this is the Martyrdom of Blandina. This is a woman, and it's preserved for us in Eusebius. So it reads, "Instead, this blessed woman, like a noble athlete, got renewed strength with her confession of faith. Her admission, 'I am a Christian. We do nothing to be ashamed of,' brought her refreshment, rest, and insensibility to her present pain. Blandina was hung on a post and exposed as bait for the wild animals that were let loose on her. She seemed to hang there in the form of a cross, and by her fervent prayers she aroused intense enthusiasm in those who were undergoing their ordeal. For in their torment, with their physical eyes, they saw in the person of their sister him who was crucified for them, that he might convince all who believe in him that all who suffer for Christ's glory will have eternal fellowship with the living God." I got a little choked up there, and let me tell you why. This is a woman, right? So all these things we've been talking about in terms of martyrology and everything that we said earlier on about Roman notions of patriarchy are undone potentially, or can be undone, certainly in the way that the early church thought about women. So this woman is literally physically transfigured in a sense, into a kind of non-identical repetition of Christ. And in doing that, she arouses the courage of her compatriots. And that, again, should be something that we should see not only as sort of part of the story, but it's also so part of what you and I, as a reader, were supposed to take away from it. If Blandina, right, can say, "I am a Christian, I do nothing to be ashamed of," why can't I say that? Right? So that's the kind of the way that these texts function during this period. All right, so let me stop there and see if there are any questions. We're just a couple minutes over. If folks need to leave, there's no problem. You can certainly feel free to do that.
Christian, we had a comment in the chat.
Okay.
Or a question actually. What can we learn about how Christians were persecuted and what is going on with African Americans today? And I'll just offer a comment to that. I mean, in general, like, I'll just say this to all of you too, this is better than any history class I had in seminary. It's just really great. And wow, thanks, Christian.
Thank you, I appreciate those comments.
I am so blown away by thinking about the parallels too between, both the way that the gospel is received in the Black enslaved communities in the United States. I'm thinking about the impact of the slave narratives in really awakening the conscience of and consciousness of white folk in the United States who became abolitionists. I'm just thinking about the images of fire and like all of these different things, like as you were talking, just really being blown away by even thinking about like, how would the church be different if we knew some of these stories and actually, you know, sought to live our lives in alignment with them. So, so that question from here in the chat is yeah, what are some of the connections and how can that open us up?
Yeah, I really appreciate actually you interlacing that question with the slave narratives. Because I think I would argue that the slave narrative tradition, and I didn't know this, by the way, until I started teaching the slave narratives at Bethel, but there's some 10,000 slave narratives that we have. And so the one that I always taught was Frederick Douglass. But I think these should be read in some ways as having a similarity with these earlier martyrological texts, because they are part historical recounting, but they oftentimes include a theological interpretation. So Douglass himself has this moment in his story where he talks about hearing his aunt being whipped. And he says that hearing her cry was like entering into the hell of slavery. He was only 5 years old. And the imagery that he uses is literally the image of death. And so this is the moment of crucifixion in Douglas's story. And then we go through his whole experience of being a slave. And we come to this other moment in the story where he gets into a tussle with Kobe, who's sort of this really ruthless slave driver. And he winds up kicking his ass. I'm sorry to use that language in church, but that's what happens. But there's this moment in which that confrontation happens, and it says that, and Douglas says, and I rose. And it's like this transformative moment, you know, resurrection. And so if we read that text, we don't just, if we're going to read it like we're talking about the martyrologies, we can't just read it as a historical text. We can't just read it as a theological interpretation of historical. We can also, though, read it as a kind of discipleship. Like, what does it mean for us to stand in solidarity with those who struggle and are oppressed, right? What does it mean for us to realize that the struggle that Douglas was undergoing was not just for his own humanity, it was also for the humanity of the slave owners. I mean, he makes that quite explicit in the narrative. So I think there's a lot of things that are very interesting here that we could kind of weave together. And I really love the slave narrative tradition in that regard, as we allow it to kind of speak to us in the now. I'm sorry, I got a little bit clamped there for a second. Are there other comments or questions?
There's none in the chats. So.
All right, looks like we're kind of closing down here. Well, I just want to thank you all for coming. Like I said, I was overly ambitious, right? 4 pages. Did we get through like 1.5? I think maybe. We'll do our best to keep moving forward, obviously, next week. And we're going to take up the question around ascetic practice and ethics, which is also central to how Christians thought of themselves in the ancient world. Thank you all so much for being here and being a part of this. It's a blessing to be able to serve you and talk about these things together. It's a privilege, frankly, from my perspective. So let me pray really quickly, and then we'll close this out. Lord, we thank you so much. We thank you for this beautiful day. It just feels like we live in paradise on some level, but we also know that our world is radically and deeply broken. And we pray, Lord, that you will make us not only deal with and even embrace our own brokenness, but make us instruments in which you can speak into the brokenness of others. Help us, Lord, to be vessels whose cracks let the light in and out. Thank you for this community. Thank you for the sense that we are going somewhere, that you're calling us somewhere. Help us to have the courage to follow. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Thanks, everybody.